At the edge of mapped space, a signal older than any star whispered across radio bands. It arrived in fragments, pulses carved with impossible geometry, hinting at structures that refused to be measured. Sector 0 traced the echo to 3 coordinates buried within declassified files, coordinates that would redraw the map of human insignificance under a darker sky. These coordinates were labeled simply Site Alpha, Site Beta, Site Gamma. Each name was bureaucratic and sterile, and each location was marked with layers of redaction. The files hinted at construction on a scale that mocked comprehension, architectures that consumed continents, corridors longer than millennia, and chambers with silence that tasted like absence, quietly. Site Alpha's first explorers described vertical facets taller than planetary crusts, metallic skin hummed like old radio, and shadows that pooled with intent. Instruments failed to map depths, compasses spun like grieving moths. The dreamers who spoke of Alpha came back changed, eyes clouded, time folded in their speech, yet their sketches matched the classified photographs with eerie fidelity. Beta was discovered beneath a frozen ocean, a lattice of ribs and cathedral halls holding oceans inside sealed domes. Remote probes recorded languages encoded into ice and currents moving against physics. The probe's last transmission ended with static shaped into syllables that human tongues refused to pronounce. Navy logs were retyped with blank margins and sealed under new signatures. Subscribe to Sector 0 for weekly archives. Gamma was the hardest to describe, not a structure, but a landscape engineered to unmake memory. Survey drones returned footage where landmarks shifted between frames, where paths rerouted themselves into landscapes that hadn't existed a moment before. Witnesses spoke of corridors that remembered you and doors that forgot your name. Gamma's maps were annotated with the word, "Do not align."
The 3 structures shared anomalies, time behaving like a reluctant tide, matter folding into improbable lattices, and a frequency that blurred consciousness. Classified teams labeled these phenomena echotopologies and cognitive transduction. Scientists argued over jargon while the affected regions continued to rewrite the rules of cause and consequence under a bureaucratic curtain of silence.
Records revealed ominous patterns, construction epochs looping every few centuries, artifacts older than human history, and signatures resembling mechanical life. Excavation teams found machinery that exhaled low, hollow breaths between cycles, like sleeping giants counting centuries. Each discovery forced a question: were these megastructures created by hands, or had they grown like petrified ecosystems from the bones of a dead cosmos? Footage from early reconnaissance showed something impossible: a stairwell that receded into deeper stairwells and returned you to the same floor, but older. Clocks found inside kept time in circular patterns, counting to numbers no calendar acknowledged. Even light behaved as if it remembered different histories, casting shadows that whispered memories not our own. Strangely, the first whistleblower, known only by the tag Hollow 4, leaked a set of pages containing coordinates and an audio file labeled The Patient. The audio was a slow breath threaded with low harmonic pulses. Official channels dismissed it as interference, but independent analysis found harmonic structures that matched human vocal patterns and a signature anomaly overlaying the breath. Sector 0's lead investigator compiled testimonies, pilots whose instruments erased minutes, scientists who aged in snapshots, and an exobiologist who swore he watched a structure blink. The more data collected, the less the world learned. Documents disappeared between agencies, witnesses were reassigned, and the public face of the investigations became a tapestry of silence and subtle misdirection. An operation called Project Sepulture was briefly declassified before being shuttered again. Its goals were clinical: map, contain, and understand. The first phase failed when teams encountered non-Euclidean hallways that siphoned language from memos. Memos returned blank, with ink solidifying into crystalline patterns that hummed when struck. The containment protocols evolved into prayers written in technical form. Field teams reported dreams when they slept near the sites, recurrent visions of cities folding into themselves, of oceans inverted into caves, of faces made entirely of negative space. The dreams spread contagiously. Men who had never met described identical skylines, as if something had impressed a single template across fractured minds, repeatedly, night. Leaked satellite images showed grids of tiny lights aligning overnight into patterns that matched archaic sigils. Analysts tried to correlate the patterns with star charts and found mismatches, symbols that aligned with points between stars, with locations outside human capacity to travel. The alignment suggested intent, as if the structures were singing to coordinates we had yet to reach. A mysterious agency dubbed the Archive appeared in redacted reports. Their emblem was a sealed tomb and a barcode. They possessed authority to retrieve artifacts, to recategorize incidents as operational anomalies, and to brief only the highest echelons. Sources claimed archive teams wore gloves that turned scratches into perfect circles and erased tape recordings into smooth silence. As leaks increased, so did the anomalies. Electrical grids adjacent to Site Beta began to store cold instead of heat. Refrigerators held winters in their coils. Pets reacted violently to midnight hours near the coordinates, becoming statues with eyes like tarnished coins. Civilian reports were dismissed as hysteria, quietly funneled into databases labeled anomalous domesticity. An old technician named Mara described an instrument that could translate structural resonance into images. When aimed at Alpha, the screen filled with doorways, each overlaying a different epoch. As the instrument rotated, doors stacked like pages, and the technician swore she saw a city folded down to the size of a coin, then watched it open and swallow the lab. The more Sector Zero probed, the clearer the pattern. The megastructures were less like buildings and more like archives of erasure, repositories that absorbed context and sealed them in layered silence. Each layer archived a civilization's memory and then removed that memory from the world, as if cataloging existence itself into a private collection. Scientists theorize the structures functioned as cosmic mortuaries, places designed to preserve and pause aspects of reality. They called them sepulchres for forms of being that had once been widespread. If that was true, then the structures were active caskets, maintaining fragments to keep something elsewhere from waking, or perhaps to keep the something contained. Tension between disclosure and containment intensified. Activists demanded transparency, journalists chased leads, and military advisories shifted into cautious obfuscation. The archive tightened control, issuing categorical denials while rerouting media. The public received sanitized briefings about unusual geological formations and classified research projects that failed to explain the missing minutes and altered memories, always ultimately.
An engineer named Kaito recorded irregularities in material cohesion, metals that softened under observation and then hardened into unreadable glyphs. His notebook described a sound like a crowd moving through long corridors, but no one else heard it. Kaito's notebook was later found with pages neatly excised, the holes forming a pattern that matched gamma-phase interference.
Encrypted logs from Project Sepulchre revealed a liaison with foreign teams, each exchanging relics and coordinates under mutual non-disclosure. Meetings occurred in airport lounges and whispering rooms, where models of the megastructures were sketched on cocktail napkins. Nations silently bartered for fragments, as if acquiring small pieces of a god's rib would grant leverage over an indifferent cosmos. The audible record contained a new anomaly, a low, recurring harmonic that mirrored the cadence of human speech and yet contained intervals mathematically impossible. Linguists proposed it functioned as a key. When played, certain doorways within the structure's altered state. Playback experiments were halted after a subject's reflection in a steel plate continued to speak after the subject stopped.
As the whistleblowers multiplied, so did the archive's cleanups. Photographs vanished from servers, and public forums were scrubbed under opaque policies. Small communities near the sites began to disappear off maps, entire towns annotated as administrative exclusion zones. The world accepted those absences with the same numbness reserved for bad weather reports. Silence deepened always. Inside Site Alpha, teams found chambers aligned like ribs, each holding a suspended object wrapped in shadow. When one object was unwrapped, the air itself seemed to hesitate, and instruments registered a local drop in probability. Researchers who observed the unwrapping lost pieces of their personal timelines, appointments, names, birthdays, erased as if the object absorbed context along with cares. The archive deployed containment arrays, vast rings of tuned oscillators meant to sing a counterfrequency into the walls. The arrays worked briefly, stabilizing gradients and restoring time's coherence in limited corridors. But the arrays required constant tuning, and each adjustment demanded signatures the archive refused to release. The operation became a ritual, technicians reciting formulas as if reciting litanies. Rumors said a creature inhabited the interstices between Beta's sealed domes, an intelligence composed of pressure and memory. Divers reported feeling watched by histories, as if the ocean itself remembered faces dragged beneath its skin. One diver surfaced with hands carved by frost, fingers missing segments that multiplied like infection across agency photographs, now unnervingly. A defector from the archive provided an outline of a failed experiment that tried to replicate the megastructure's effects at small scale. The experiment produced a room that kept returning to the same starting state, a looping cell where a plant sprouted and then unsprouted daily. The replication created a local ecology of forgetting, where nothing retained past instances for more than hours. Analysts found that the three sites shared harmonic signatures with ancient artifacts recovered from disparate archaeological digs, ivory tablets, basalt idols, and glass that predated recorded metallurgy. These artifacts hummed faintly when brought together in controlled conditions, generating interference patterns that matched the structure's architectural blueprints, suggesting a dispersed industry of construction across epochs, always.
An intercepted memo mentioned a term that would later become whispered legend: the silent tombs. The memo described megastructures not as dead relics, but as staging grounds, places where civilizations were folded away and catalogued. The archive's notes implied fear that the tombs were not passive storages, but active curators, rearranging what they held and deciding what might be returned, if ever. Inside archival footage, a child's drawing surfaced, arches and towers labeled with dates far older than human calendars. The sketch matched satellite noise patterns exactly, though the family remembered nothing of it. The image appeared in a locked folder time-stamped before the child was born, as if memory had leaked backward through paper and light, and handwriting remembered futures.
Local myths entwined with the sites, fishermen who charted haunting currents, and farmers who swore fields had been sown by stars. Anthropologists found oral tales aligning to impossible maps, songs describing doorways where ancestors entered and never returned. The patterns suggested repeated encounters across cultures, as if the megastructures had touched many shores and left a scattered litany of half-remembered rituals.
A surveillance team recorded a transient window of clarity, an alignment of planetary bodies that quieted the structures briefly. In that hush, images bloomed, galleries filled with stored sunsets, shelves of measured grief, and records paced like lungs. Scientists raced to capture data, but the window snapped closed, taking with it a catalogued hour, and leaving only the sensation of loss and urgently incomplete logs. An engineer clandestinely reverse-engineered a glyph from Alpha's hall. When reproduced, it resonated like a tuning fork across distant halls. Its resonance unlocked nested messages, pattern layers that read like coordinates and lullabies. Those who listened too long reported déjà vu so intense they abandoned professions, returning to small corners of life with empty pockets and hollowed intent, as if called by something patient. A former archivist published a manifest detailing transfers, boards, crates, shipments of artifacts moved between sites at odd intervals. The crates were numbered like liturgical objects and sealed with wax, stamped by unfamiliar sigils. Each shipment synced with localized disappearances and archival spikes, suggesting the archive was not merely containing, but curating selections for purposes that read like ritual, not science. A clandestine expedition into Beta's deep halls recorded an impossible choir under the ice, a chorus shaped by pressure and tuned to frequencies below hearing. The sound buoyed objects into levitation and rearranged sediment into script. The team lost synchronized time. Their logs repeated identical handwriting until ink bled. When they surfaced, their watches all marked different pasts, as if time had been soldered to the ice.
An exogeologist documented mineral growths around Gamma's periphery that absorbed light and re-emitted it as memory. Samples leaked dreams in labs. Technicians awoke speaking lost dialects and reciting ancient weather. The spectra refused classification, resembling both crystal and woven fabric, and between lamellae lay patterns matching schematics from the archive's deepest vaults, as if stone had kept blueprints of vanished builders.
Cross-referencing personnel files revealed erasures, names scrubbed, service records truncated, careers annotated as reassigned without public notice. Families filed petitions that vanished into administrative limbo. Those who pressed inquiries found paperwork reappearing with new dates, as if someone rewrote chapters to conceal proximity to the silent tombs. The bureaucracy became a second architecture of silence, rooms of paper that erased humans. A physicist named Dr. Sorin proposed a model. The structures operate at an interface between topology and narrative, folding histories as materials fold paper. His equations predicted local causality inversion zones, where events retroactively altered antecedents. The model terrified committees. A single misapplied proof could erase a timetable. They shelved his work behind clearance and locked language that resembled liturgy more than math. Children born near the sites displayed peculiar markers, an aversion to mirrors, a habit of humming pitches absent from nursery songs, and an uncanny familiarity with ancient maps. Pediatric studies were quietly halted when patterns suggested developmental changes tied to proximity. Researchers' slides vanished from conferences, later replaced by papers on neutral topics, as if someone had redirected curiosity with surgical indifference.
A journalist embedded with a cleanup crew witnessed a crate unseal itself in transit. Inside lay a pulsing object wrapped in a textile that shifted like oil on water. The crate's GPS logged a detour, coordinates that blinked briefly into an area marked only with a symbol, then vanished. The journalist's footage corrupted thereafter, frames spiraling and repeating like a film looping on a ruined projector.
A theologian interviewed survivors who described rituals performed by authorities before entering sites, sequences of steps, whispered primes, and offerings of numbered papers. The rituals resembled liturgy, yet were delivered in procedural voice, as if faith and code had become indistinguishable. The theologian feared the archive had replaced sacrament with protocol, consecrating containment through bureaucracy instead of prayer. Satellite rainfall maps near Beta displayed showers that fell at impossible angles, bending like strands toward the ice domes. Meteorologists noted anomalies contradicting regional models, rain threaded toward structural nodes as if siphoned by an appetite of information. Cities downwind recorded sudden quiet. Birds hushed, radios lost carrier, an effect later cataloged clinically as local acoustic nulling with terse margins and no comfort. An old radioactive sample catalog showed decays reversing briefly after exposure to alpha's field. Instruments flagged events where decay sequences rewound, producing particles in mirrored order. The effect allowed reconstructions of signals once thought lost, but attempts to harness reversal led to memories appearing in lab logs with timestamps displaced by days. Retrieval came at the cost of scrambled chronology. A small group of civilians formed the Rememberers to map absences. They collected stories, sketches, and artifacts from families whose histories bore blanks. Their map was patchwork, stitched with glue and resilience, annotating what institutions erased. The Rememberers insisted memory had mutated into a resource worth defending, an act of refusal against a system that cataloged lives into silent drawers to be opened or withheld. The Rememberers' map grew into a clandestine atlas, pages curling with lost birthdays and erased weddings. They compared gaps across generations and found overlap, names that vanished twice, artifacts that reappeared altered. Their work attracted exiled scientists and artists who encoded memory into songs and tapes, hoping subtlety might survive the archive's machines long enough to be heard. A rogue data scientist named Elan built a playback device that stitched fragments into continuity. The machine assembled incomplete frames into a ghostly narrative, revealing vanished towns, laughter in rooms with no walls, and a child's silhouette walking across a shoreline that had been erased from maps. Authorities confiscated the prototype, but pirated schematics spread like sympathetic ink. A satellite listening post picked up a coded lullaby emanating from Gamma. The melody carried coordinates that aligned with historical dottle fields and vanished libraries. When researchers decoded the tune, files reappeared in archives with annotations in unknown script. The archive countered by classifying the decode as misinformation, yet the music continued to leak through static and late-night radios. A covert team entered Alpha years after initial surveys and found rooms where memories had physiques, laughter, grief, and small domestic habits stacked like fossils. They cataloged behaviors in jars labeled with dates that refused to hold. When the team took a jar home, their spouses remembered different lives. Anniversaries shifted, and family photographs rearranged themselves into new histories overnight. Reports surfaced of inverse architects, creatures or systems that built by removing rather than adding. Blueprints showed voids carved into matter, corridors traced by absence. Field architects tried to model the process and found their CAD files deleting nodes that corresponded to human names. The phenomenon suggested an intelligence that preferred negative space, identity defined by what it took away. An epidemic of déjà vu spread through towns near Gamma. Citizens repeatedly walked the same errands, convinced they had not. Pharmacies noted duplicate prescriptions. Courts recorded identical testimonies across unrelated cases. The archive labeled the effect a cognitive echo and imposed curfews. Curfew notices appeared blank for days on end, then rewritten in hands no one in the town recognized. In a rare breach, an archive file leaked containing a schematic for a return protocol. It proposed sequencing of light and silence to coax a memory back into the world. Tests produced fleeting returns, a market scent, a laugh, a song fragment. Each return cost something, a week of sleep, a neighbor's name, making restoration a moral calculus cloaked in desperation. Internal memos referenced a term older than the archive, custodians. The custodians were theoretical stewards tasked with balancing returns and erasures. Interviews with former operatives hinted at tribunals deciding whether a memory might jeopardize wider reality. The idea of judges weighing human recollection chilled the research community, who recognized that preservation could be weaponized with gentle cruelty. A cadre of hackers developed counter-ink, files that resisted redaction by embedding memory into noise. They broadcast encoded recollections across shortwave frequencies, seeding radios with fragments of lost weddings and childhood songs. The archive retaliated by jamming bans and issuing penalties. Underground networks persisted, playing stolen echoes to keep human threads from unspooling entirely in the dark. A geometer noted that the architectures employed fractal apertures tuned to biological rhythms, breath, heartbeat, blinking. When matched, the apertures opened as if greeting kin. Field medics discovered that synchronized breathing near certain thresholds could induce transient clarity, offering a terrifyingly intimate way to approach a structure. Not with machines, but with shared, fragile lungs. A scholar named Amina argued these were not solely repositories, but teaching engines, devices that refined reality by excising anomalies and replaying sanitized versions. Her theory implied a cosmic pedagogy, the universe pruning itself to become legible. Critics accused her of romanticizing control.
Others feared the archive already enacted curriculum decisions about which pasts deserved survival.
An experimental composer threaded silence into symphonies to mimic the structure's patterns. Audiences reported waking with foreign memories and tears for lives they never lived. The composer vanished after a final performance. The recording survived in a bootleg that occasionally reappears on midnight forums. Listeners swear it rearranges their wardrobes and recollections with microscopic, patient edits. Evidence suggested the silent tombs had predated humanity's rise, perhaps seeded by a civilization that encoded its ethics into architecture. If so, their legacy was ambiguous: preservation by omission or a means of preventing recurrence. Scholars debated whether returning such memories would heal or unleash patterns that led to the structure's original downfall, a dilemma with no consensus and few comforts. As public pressure mounted, government staged a summit masked as scientific transparency. Cameras observed polite statements, while black-suited delegates traded dossiers under tables. The summit concluded with a memorandum delaying disclosure and expanding exclusion zones. Outside, protesters chanted for the lost and the returned, their slogans eaten by static as their chants crossed the threshold toward a site and thinned into whispers. In a final, leaked directive, archive leadership suggested a radical option: to seal the sites permanently by collapsing the interface and accepting cultural loss as a stabilizing sacrifice. The recommendation split officials. Some advocated closure to prevent contagion. Others warned of irreversible cultural amputation. The choice framed a fundamental question: what is the value of a memory when it threatens the coherence of the world? The final entry in Sector Zero's dossier remains redacted, but echoes persist. Laughter in empty rooms, songs that belong to nobody, and maps that remind us of absence. We leave the choice unresolved as custodians weigh return against ruin. If you want more declassified threads and dark anomalies, subscribe to Sector Zero for weekly archives, and keep listening to the silence.